I'm very pleased to welcome Godfre Leung, whose talk is about Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a loaded term, rewriting Vancouver art history, 1989 to 1997. Godfre, I don't know why I keep calling you Jeffrey. Godfre is a critic and curator based in Mohkinstsis, Calgary. His writing has appeared in magazines such as the ArtAsiaPacific, Art in America, C Magazine, The Third Rail, and Yishu, Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art, and has been commissioned for publications by a number of institutions, including the Museum of Modern Art and the Walker Art Center. As part of his recent curatorial project, Unstately, he organized the exhibitions Pao Houa Her, Emplotment at the Orr Gallery in 2020, and Guesthood and Alienhood, Sun Yung Shin, Jinny Yu, Republic of the Other, for Hotam Press Bookshop Gallery in 2021. He's also been commissioned and edited the poetry book Granted to a Foreign Citizen by Sun Yung Shin for ArtSpeak in 2020. He holds a PhD in Visual Cultural Studies from the University of Rochester and has taught courses at the Eastman School of Music, University of Rochester, Ontario College of Art and Design, now OCAD University, and St. Cloud State University, where he was the Assistant Associate Professor of Art History from 2012 to 2018. He is currently the Artistic Director for the Artist-Run Center, The Bows, here in Calgary. The history of Vancouver, the history of Vancouver's art is likely Canada's most thoroughly narrated municipal art history. In this talk, Godfre lays out some groundwork to reimagine several dominant narratives of the city's recent past, recasting its abiding metaphors from terminal city of settler-colonialist expansion to connective transnational node. Godfre, it is wonderful to welcome you here today. And I will just stop sharing my screen and invite you to take over.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for the invitation, for forcing me to write this thing that I've wanted to actually put on the page for a while. It's great to be here. Thanks everybody for sharing your lunch with me. Just gonna share my screen. There you go. And and before I start, just quickly apologize for being a little froggy today. But I'll start now. The history of Vancouver art is probably the most thoroughly narrated municipal art history in this country. I don't know why exactly that is, but there's probably some truth to the usual, if oversimplified and in some ways misleading answer, that the city's geographic separation from this country's centers of cultural power in Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal developed an inward-looking tradition. And once a handful of those artists rose to international acclaim, that self-referentiality turned into self-mythologizing. It's more interesting, though, to look at that two-step answer as a historical sequence. The geographic separation named in the first part of that formulation is the scrappy DIY artistic culture that fomented in Vancouver in the 1960s and 70s, which apparently nobody out east cared about. Some relevant names include Carol Itter, Al Neal, Ingrid Baxter and Ian Baxterand, Vincent Trazoff and Michael Morris, Gary Lee Nova, Kate Craig, Eric Metcalf, Hank Bull, Tom Burrows, with Anna Banana participating from abroad until her return to BC at the beginning of the 80s. And the rise to international acclaim is associated with 5 artists in particular: Stan Douglas, Rodney Graham, Ken Lum, Jeff Wall, and Ian Wallace, who are often known by the critical shorthand Vancouver Photoconceptualism. Jeff Wall was the first to blow up. In 1989, he was added to a traveling European exhibition curated by Jean-François Chevalier and James Lingwood called Another Objectivity, which forecasted for the 1990s the predominance of large format photography and a kind of return to artistry in reaction to the appropriation art of Cindy Sherman and Barbara Kruger that defined 1980s photographic practice. And so in this installation shot, in the Italy version of that exhibition, on the far right, you see in the distance a photograph by Jeff Wall displayed in a light box. In the center is, I believe, John Copeland's, and on the left is Günter Ferg. That same year, Charrier also brought the work of Douglas, Leung, Wall, and Wallace as a grouping together in a survey exhibition in Stuttgart called Fotokunst. Stan Douglas and Ken Lum, both over a decade younger than Wall and Wallace, saw their reputation swell through the 90s. If Wall is the most famous and highly collected of the photoconceptualists, Douglas is probably already the most historically important, and Lum went the farthest afield in his work and entered the widest and most diverse range of conversations. But the international reputation and critical reception of these artists is beside the point, except that they had one. This initiated a cottage industry of Vancouver talking about Vancouver, a catalyzing early salvo of which was the Vancouver Anthology, a lecture series at Western Front organized by Stan Douglas in 1990, which would be published as an actual anthology by Or Gallery in 1991. The end result of this, in Vancouver, not abroad, is the consolidation of a telling of Vancouver art and Vancouver history through the photographs of Douglas, Graham, Lum, Wall, Wallace, and other figures such as Roy Arden and Arnie Haraldson. Fellow travelers often grouped in these exhibitions include Vicki Alexander, Theodore Wan, and Jinny Yu, with Tim Lee and Jeremy Shaw as the most internationally recognized of the photoconceptualists' legatees. There isn't a name for this, but I'm going to call it Vancouver photo history. Many of the well-known works by the big five photoconceptualists, with Stan Douglas often in video, depicted their hometown of Vancouver. Much of this work by Lum and Wall is from the late 70s and 80s. Douglas's early videos would also fit here, but most of his well-known works that touch on Vancouver from the late 90s and beyond do so self-consciously and carefully stage the Vancouver of previous eras as cinematic mise-en-scène. But Vancouver photo history is more of a curatorial practice than a photographic practice or aesthetic. Vancouver photo history marshals these images of Vancouver in the 70s and 80s as documents, which is ironic given the conceptual and photoconceptual. Documents of a Vancouver whose urban environment changed beyond recognition between 1989 and 1997. But most of Jeff Wall's photographs of Vancouver in the 80s aren't about urban development per se. Some are, but most aren't. They just are set in a version of the city that it came to very quickly no longer look like. It's an interesting parallel. Through the 90s, Vancouver began to top most livable cities in the world lists and gave rise to an urban planning phenomenon called Vancouverism. To quote the definition of the City of Vancouver on the City of Vancouver webpage, quote, Vancouverism means tall, slim towers for density, widely separated by low-rise buildings for light, air, and views. It means many parks, walkable streets, and public spaces, combined with an emphasis on sustainable forms of transit. Internationally, the success of these five artists from Vancouver signaled the flashiness of the new millennial metropolis as it was hailed as a forerunner to, sorry, I said that wrong. Internationally, the success of these five artists from Vancouver signaled the flashiness of the new millennial metropolis it was hailed as a forerunner to, especially the slick light boxes that Wall and later also Graham displayed their photographs in. At the same time, the ethnicity of Douglas and Lum represented to the world Vancouver's celebrated multiculturalism. But back home, their images of Vancouver came to be endlessly framed in survey exhibitions as melancholy artifacts of a lost city. What's at stake here is a politics of disappearance. Stan Douglas's circa 1948, originally an immersive video installation and now an iPhone app, recreates Hogan's Alley, Vancouver's historic Black neighborhood that in 1970 was demolished to build the Georgia Viaduct, which was originally slated to be the on-ramp to a freeway project that was later aborted. And for those of you who don't know Vancouver, but have watched Hockey Night in Canada, in the late game when they show Vancouver's arena, that overpass that encircles the arena is the viaduct. Another of Vancouver's most well-known works of art, Rebecca Belmore's Vigil, commemorates the lives of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. And there is no cultural event in Vancouver that doesn't begin with an acknowledgement that the city rests on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. But the backward looking of Vancouver photo history, while it at times absorbs all of this and more, speaks to a different kind of disappearance. Almost uniformly unstated in these exhibitions is how the city was lost. In 1984, the United Kingdom and People's Republic of China signed the British-Sino Joint Declaration, in which Hong Kong was to be ceded to China in 1997. In 1986, Vancouver declared itself to the world with Expo 86, and 2 years later, the Expo lands were sold amid much controversy to Hong Kong billionaire Li Ka-shing, simultaneously signaling to Hong Kong the desirability of Vancouver real estate and initiating a 35 years and counting panic in Vancouver over foreign buyers. And I say that with quotation marks. In 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacre occurred. These events set into motion an unprecedented wave of immigration from Hong Kong to Vancouver, and with it, a total upheaval of the city's urban fabric. If we look at this retrospectively, in 2016, with Vancouver eclipsing New York as the most expensive real estate market in the world, the province of BC imposed a foreign buyer tax, an additional 15% surcharge, later raised to 20%, for buyers of property in Metro Vancouver who are not Canadian citizens or permanent residents. This January, Bloomberg reported that, and I quote, Vancouver home sales break record despite tax on foreign buyers. All to say, immigrants from Hong Kong, who after 1997 came to be eclipsed by immigrants from mainland China and Taiwan, became the scapegoat for the world's most unaffordable housing market. In this context, photographs such as Roy Arden's condominium advertisement Vancouver, BC, and Monster House Coquitlam, BC, became dog whistles when they appear in Vancouver photo history exhibitions. In the first photograph, the 888 in the development's address tells us that the building is aimed at Chinese buyers. 8 is a lucky number for Chinese people because it rhymes with prosperity. 8s are highly sought out in phone numbers, license plates, and for those with the luxury to pick and choose, addresses. The term monster house in the second photograph's title refers to what at the time was thought to be an unneighborly form of architecture favored by new Hong Kong immigrants, in which houses were built right to the edge of the property. These immigrants, one must remember, were used to tiny multi-generational shoebox apartments in Hong Kong. Much more interesting is Ken Lum's Nancy Nishi Zhoping Chow Real Estate of 1990. Here's a paragraph on the photograph by literary critic Eco Day, and I'm quoting Day. Much anti-Hong Kong Chinese sentiment came to the surface in 1988, when 216 luxury condominiums in the False Creek area were sold exclusively to Chinese buyers. The sales took all of 3 hours and circumvented the Canadian market, leading to charges that Hong Kong investors were taking over the city. Although the roots of the city's demographic shifts and spatial reconfigurations are often the result of state-led efforts to expedite Vancouver's integration into the global economy, the racial outcome of these processes has effectively reinforced the perception that Asians represent pure market rationality. As such, Nancy Nishi Zhoping Chow Real Estate evokes a kind of racial anxiety associated with Asians that registers a kind of bad capital associated with the abstract sphere of foreign investment and real estate speculation. And this passage is from Alien Capital, Asian Racialization and the Logic of Settler-Colonial Capitalism, Day's brilliant study on the personification of Asians by Asians of bad capital in North America. I wonder, though, what kind of ambivalence is at play here? How much criticality and how much Lum's photograph, when presented within the course of Vancouver photo history, behaves like Arden's photographs? With respect to the politics of disappearance, it's hard not to notice that Leung had a long and ongoing interest in monuments. Most notably, Monument to East Vancouver, and Vancouver especially, a Vancouver special scaled to its property value in 1973, then increased eightfold. And so like, just to be clear, like what you see on the bottom here is in a narrow passageway or in a narrow lot between two buildings, administered by the Artist One Center 221A in Vancouver's Chinatown, is a scale model of a Vancouver special by Ken Leung right here. And so you can see it's tiny, and it's been increased eightfold to even be that size. But these two monuments might also be, these two later monuments by Leung might also be ambivalent gestures. When the City of the Press talks about the monument to East Vancouver, they talk about East Van as traditionally working class and its gentrification over the last 2 decades. The Vancouver Special, a style of mass-produced Vancouver home that was discontinued in the mid-80s, is an emblem of East Van in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But to Chinese people in Vancouver of a certain age, Vancouver Specials in East Van are also super Chinese. I've never met Ken Leung, and I'm not here to psychoanalyze him, but I'm trying to understand what this image means to a multi-generationally Canadian Chinese person. Kathy Park Hung describes minor feelings, her celebrated memoir's eponymous key term, as dysphoric, caused by a cognitive dissonance when experiencing two incompatible racial realities. Hung didn't relate the dysphoric state that she described to the phenomenon of gender dysphoria, but I think between the lines she was proposing, by way of an analogy, a racial dysphoria along those lines. In North America, Asian bodies are often thought to be indistinguishable. Does Leung see himself in Nancy Nishi and Zhou Pingchao's bodies? And maybe to put a finer point on it, does he want to, and how does that feel to him? What did the Expo land sale look like to him? Given the later East Van works, what are his politics of disappearance? Ten years later, in 2000, as he was beginning to see the truly global scope of his career, Leung wrote that, quote, "The richest lessons to be offered to artists and historians are connections that go beyond the standard New York, Paris, or Berlin, Moscow foldings to places such as Vancouver, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Beijing, Nairobi, London, etc." This would seem to geographically remap Vancouver's place in the world. Conversely, in his essay for the catalog to intertitle Vancouver Art and Artists, a survey exhibition of Vancouver art staged in Antwerp in 2005, Ian Wallace described the historical Vancouver of Carol Itter, Al Neal, and the other scrappy DIY artists operating outside the orbit of Toronto and Ottawa as, quote, the edge of the art world, and, quote, frontier of the avant-garde. In that sense, Vancouver's place at the end of the railroad rhymes with a settler-colonialist expansion that is the ongoing heartbeat of this country, resource extraction being now its lifeblood. Leung's formulation allows us to deracinate, at least somewhat, the ugly metaphors that so-called critical art is scaffolded on: pioneering, trailblazing, avant-garde. The flip side of this is Vancouver photo history's place in relation to, the politics of disappearance I had associated with Stan Douglas and Rebecca Belmore. In her essay for the Vancouver anthology, Construction of the Imaginary Indian, which 3 decades later is still the finest piece of writing ever written about art in BC, Marcia Crosby describes a colonial unconscious to a West Coast tradition that Jeff Wall sees himself and his peers as a counter-tradition to, but which Vancouver photo history has nonetheless conscripted him as the culmination of. Characterizing the originary work of Emily Carr, Crosby writes, quote, "Carr locates her work within the salvage paradigm. She describes the totem pole she paints as belonging to a geographical space, a landscape devoid of its original owners. The issue here is that the induction of First Nations people's history and heritage into institutions as a lost Canadian heritage, and this is still Crosby speaking, should be considered within the context of the colonization of Aboriginal land, end of quotes. In the place of the displaced residents of Hogan's Alley, the disappeared, missing, and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, and the land dispossessed First Peoples more broadly, Vancouver photo history implies the presumed subjects of Wall and Company's photographs to be unsettled by the Hong Kong and then successively Taiwanese and mainland Chinese immigrants, who destroyed the housing market and initiated a still ongoing wave of involuntary white flight. It probably doesn't need to be said that this is a further displacement of those displaced people in Douglas's and Belmore's work, here from the contemporary cultural landscape, rendered, as Crosby might argue, first distantly historical, then ultimately imaginary. But it's maybe also a particularly perverse mutation of what Eve Tuck and Kei Wen Yang have called settler moves to innocence. I'd like now to transition to work by two Hong Kong diasporic artists, both of whom were born in Hong Kong, raised largely elsewhere, and have returned to Hong Kong. To see Vancouver from the outside and propose another way art can help us look at Vancouver in the 90s. Samson Young's 2019 exhibition, It's a Heaven Over There, emerged from his archival research on Juan Alexander Gamyao, purportedly the first Chinese person born in Canada. What interested Young is that though Wang Gamyao had never been to China, he was an active member of the Chinese Empire Reform Association at the turn of the 20th century, and a follower of the exiled Chinese reformist and utopian philosopher Gang Yaowei. In Young's own words, quote, in 1898, the Guangxu Emperor and the reformists, led by Gang Yaowei, initiated what was now known as the 100-Day Reform Movement, which sought to modernize the Chinese nation mostly through education and industrial reforms. The effort was cut short by a coup staged by Empress Dowager Cixi, who saw the reformist ideas as radical and placed the emperor under house arrest. Gang Yaowei fled to Canada and, together with the Chinese community leaders of Victoria, BC, he founded the Chinese Empire Reform Association to continue the work of the reformists from overseas through diplomacy and advocacy. Samson Young continues, because there was so very little in the archives about Wang Gamyao as a person, it gave me the opportunity to really imagine his relationship with Gang Yaowei and with China. The typical story of the Chinese diaspora is that someone leaves her or his hometown in China in search of a more affluent life in the West. Wang Gamyao gave me the opportunity to imagine the opposite, a romanticized image of China, the modern and utopian Chinese nation, as described in Gang Yaowei's Book of Great Unity, that was never realized, conjured by a Canadian-born Chinese person at a time and in a nation where he faced racial discrimination, end of quote. The work that Young ended up creating, Dai Dai Gongxi, was an animated video installation depicting Wang Gamyao envisioning the unrealized utopian modernized China, which morphs mid-daydream into a 1980s shopping mall. The work Dai Dai Gongxi was named after a legendary Hong Kong department store from the 80s, which came to spectacularly fail. Young's exhibition's site specificity was crucial. It's a Heaven Over There was a reopening exhibition of Center A in its new location in the then newly revitalized Sun Hua Center in Vancouver's Chinatown. Excuse me. Built in 1987 as a shopping mall to primarily serve the Chinese people in Vancouver who used to go to Chinatown to buy Chinese stuff, the Sun Hua Center was underused for the entirety of its existence before 2018, when its primary tenant became the arts nonprofit BC Artscape, which converted much of the mall into artist studios and several galleries. Young's video rhymed the displacement of Wang Gamyao's utopian vision to his diasporic community and the literal exile of Gang Yaowei from China with the original ambitions of its site. In 1989, not long after Sun Hua Center opened, North America's paradigmatic Asian mall, Aberdeen Center, opened in Richmond, the suburb that also absorbed the highest concentration of Hong Kong immigrants. And with this wave of immigration also moved the center of Chinese shopping in Greater Vancouver, leaving Sun Hua to become the kind of retail apocalypse mall ghost town you see videos of on the internet, or mall ruin porn, as Samson described it to me. Thinking back to Marcia Crosby's critique of Emily Carr and Everything After, to tweet Crosby's coinage, West Coast nature as devoided landscape, Young's exhibition might help us to envision Vancouver as not a hollowed out void or unlivable money pit, as those who have left it often feel. If what was to be mourned in the failure of Sun Wah wasn't lost money and unrealized retail, but a community gathering place that never was, that gathering place did in fact exist. It just turned out to be enrichment. None of this begins to address the complexity of Asian mobility and settlerhood, and the cooperation and complicity of immigrants within a settler colonial state is the thing I want this project to ultimately lead to, but haven't figured out how yet. But this does begin to decenter the subject presumed by Vancouver photo history's politics of disappearance. And I'm sorry, I don't actually have a good installation photograph of the video installation. So here's the staging, but there's not a good, I don't have a good photograph of the video itself and the depiction of Wang Gumyao, the Chinese utopia, and then the mall. In 2018, Christopher K. Ho presented an exhibition at Desart Gallery in Hong Kong called CX888, named after the Cathay Pacific flight from JFK Airport in New York to Hong Kong with a layover in Vancouver. Occasioned by his daydreams about leaving the United States, where he was raised and where he'd been practicing as an artist for over 15 years, in the wake of the soul-destroying 2016 US election, Ho staged the interior cabin of an airplane with two monitors in the corporate colors of Cathay Pacific and a subsidiary, Cathay Dragon, blinking in the meter of Homer's The Odyssey. The work is about returning home, and more broadly, the phenomenon of reverse diaspora. Though on the minor feelings wavelength, in one of our first conversations, Chris told me that CX888 was about wanting to go back to Hong Kong to, for once in my adult life, be in the majority. But what's also interesting is what it says about Vancouver in relation to Hong Kong. Historically, Hong Kong has thought of itself as a kind of void. In 1997, in his landmark book, Hong Kong, Culture and the Politics of Disappearance, theorist Akbar Abbas characterized Hong Kong as, quote, a city of transients. Refugees or expatriates thought of Hong Kong as a temporary stop, no matter how long they stayed. Samson Yung said basically the same thing to me in an interview in 2019, quote, many Hong Kong people see Hong Kong not as a home, but as a transitional place from which they seek a better future elsewhere. But what we saw in the undercurrent of Hong Kong autonomy politics from the handover in 1997 to 2003 during the first demonstrations during the SARS quarantine, to Occupy Central with Love and Peace in 2014, to the events of the last several years surrounding the Chinese extradition bill and anti-sedition law, is that in moments when political autonomy and the civil rights that enable these things are being threatened, Hong Kongers begin to talk instrumentally about the importance of its civil society and the uniqueness of its culture. Which is also to say, culture was there all along. It only needed to be looked at as culture and named as such. We can relate this to the Hong Kong diaspora culture in Greater Vancouver that is at the heart of Vancouver photo history, but never actually present except as an existential threat. If we strip away the invading occupying force and agent of disruption that the 89 to 97 wave is figured as in photo history, and the racist oxymoronic idea of an overrepresented minority, how might we enjoy the things that they built? What have we been missing this whole time? This is what Ho says about Vancouver's place in CX888, and I quote, passengers disembark late at night between New York, the post-war West's financial capital, and Hong Kong, the Far East's, into a holding pen at Vancouver International Airport. Regardless of whether they are in first, business, premium economy, or economy class, they are in limbo, with only a closed Tim Hortons donut cart to indicate the country nominally occupied. The no place of the elusive donut hole is perhaps a fitting metaphor for a city with immigration policies that encourage a model of belonging that's flexible, pragmatic, even instrumental. In Ho's formulation, nominally occupied, we might see a way of thinking immigration outside of settlerhood. The metaphor of the layover opens up a range of different kinds of affiliations, and like the actual lives of Samson Young and Christopher K. Ho, multinational identities and pathways of immigration that are partial or at least not permanent. There's room for an ethics about the land here that I haven't arrived at yet, but I think it might lie in the remapping of Vancouver's place in the world, from terminal city to a connective node, and in relationships of hospitality and reciprocity. And this is ironic because all of this is about real estate, but also in relations outside of settlers presuming an ownership and birthright to land. Layover is probably not the kindest word to name these relationships, but I like the forceful challenge it poses to the naturalized settlerhood I've described at the heart of Vancouver photo history. The last thing I'll show is the teaser image for Christopher K. Ho's CX-889, which is named after CX-888's return flights, an upcoming public art installation at the Vancouver Art Gallery's offsite location, which will be unveiled this June, in the week leading up to the 25th anniversary of the Hong Kong handover. The image you see here is a replica of a no entry sign at Hong Kong's old Kai Tak airport, where loved ones would see passengers off as they ascended a ramp to enter the terminal. The sign is rendered in lenticular and crossed with the design of a giant checkerboard sign that, because Kai Tak was right in the city, served as a visual signal for pilots of incoming flights to begin a terrifying 45-degree turn with almost no margin for error before landing. And here is the not quite final blurb for the project. Hong Kong-based artist Christopher K. Ho's CX-889 pays tribute to the wave of Hong Kong to Vancouver immigration between 89 and 97. The installation restages partially remembered landmarks from Hong Kong's beloved Kai Tak Airport, which was dismantled a year after the handover of Hong Kong sovereignty from the United Kingdom to the People's Republic of China. CX-889 evokes the disorienting but warm reactivation of familiar sights, sounds, rhythms, and scents after a trans-Pacific flight, a state of unwakefulness that may also inform memories of Vancouver in the 1990s, when the city and its surrounding municipalities changed beyond recognition. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Godfre.